Think about the last time someone ruined your day. Not someone who did something catastrophic, not a crisis, just a comment, a tone of voice, a message that sat wrong, a look across a room that you couldn't stop replaying 3 hours later. Even though, if you're honest, nothing actually happened. The meeting ended, the conversation moved on. Everyone else forgot about it, but you carried it home. You carried it into dinner, into the shower, into bed. You ran the scenario forward and backward, imagined what you should have said, rehearsed what you might say next time, wondered what they really meant, decided they probably don't like you, revised that, decided you were overreacting, revised that too. And somewhere around midnight, you were still in a conversation that ended at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Sound familiar? Here's what Daniel Chidiac would say about that. You were not the victim of that person. You were the victim of a pattern, a way of processing the world that takes what other people think, feel, say, and do, and treats it like an emergency that requires your full emotional attention immediately and indefinitely. And the terrifying thing is that most people who do this don't even know they're doing it, because it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like just how you are. It feels like your personality. 2013, a man in Sydney sits down to write. He is not a therapist, not a psychologist, not an academic. He is someone who has spent years watching himself and the people around him get quietly destroyed. Not by major events, not by genuine tragedy, but by the slow, invisible drain of letting everything in. Every slight, every silence, every social media comment, every person in a bad mood who made it their business to share it. His name is Daniel Chidiac. And the question he sat down to answer was not complicated. Why do some people move through the world like they have an invisible shield? Not cold, not closed off, genuinely warm and present, and yet somehow other people's chaos just doesn't stick to them. The way Chidiac pursued that answer is a story in itself. He didn't start with a massive publishing deal. He was just a man in Melbourne, Australia, essentially self-publishing his observations, because he realized this pattern, this absorbing of the world's emotional weight, wasn't just a personal failing, it was an epidemic. His work resonated so deeply, it was eventually picked up by Penguin Random House, and he became a global best-selling author. He even ended up consulting for various media figures, which led to a rather surreal moment where he appeared as himself on The Real Housewives of Miami in 2025. But beneath all that very public presence, the core framework from his 2025 book, Stop Letting Everything Affect You, remains deeply grounded in psychology. And I want to stop right there on that title, Stop Letting Everything Affect You, because the first time I read it, my reaction was defensive. If I am someone who feels things deeply, if a passive-aggressive email from a coworker genuinely makes my stomach drop, a title like that feels like a command I literally cannot follow. It's like telling a tall person to stop hitting their head on low doorways. Are we just supposed to turn off our empathy entirely and become emotionally numb? That defensiveness is the exact barrier most people hit right away, and it's completely justified. For a long time, the self-help industry told people their sensitivity was a character flaw, a weakness they needed to toughen up and get over. But Chidiac's framework, which draws heavily on the clinical research of Dr. Elaine Aron, flips that entirely. Aron establishes a very strict line between feeling deeply, which is an absolute superpower, and letting everything affect you, which is a structural leak in your emotional plumbing. Her pioneering research on highly sensitive people, or HSPs, proves that roughly 20% of the population is born with a structurally more reactive nervous system. Not a trauma response, not a quirky personality trait, biological hardware. If you put an HSP in an fMRI machine, their brain processes sensory input and emotional cues at a much deeper level than the other 80% of the population. Their pupils dilate more in response to light. They register micro-expressions on people's faces that others completely miss. They walk into a boardroom and instantly feel the unspoken tension between two colleagues. The hardware is just highly calibrated. The problem is what happens when that highly calibrated hardware runs into childhood conditioning. Imagine a child who has to figure out whether it is safe to ask for help with homework based solely on the sound of how hard their parent closed the car door in the driveway. The brain learns that survival depends on hyper-analyzing every single environmental cue. If you grow up in an environment where your emotions aren't validated or where you have to monitor the moods of adults to avoid conflict, that biological sensitivity gets weaponized into a radar that never turns off. You carry it into adulthood. You analyze the pause before your boss says hello. You analyze the period at the end of a text message. And you tell yourself you're doing it because you're a deeply empathetic person. But the research draws a very sharp, almost brutal distinction between empathy and enmeshment, and most highly sensitive people spend their whole lives confusing the two. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. It is standing next to a friend who is in a dark hole and saying, "I see that you are in pain, I understand why, and I am here with you." Enmeshment is jumping into the hole with them, breaking your own leg and saying, "Now we are both in pain, so I must really care about you." Empathy is understanding their feelings. Enmeshment is making their feelings your personal urgent responsibility. You set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. And this brings us to one of the most important pivots in the book. When you are enmeshed, you spend hours obsessing over what the other person is thinking. You replay the dialogue loops. Chidiac calls this oversinking. But from a clinical perspective, this relentless rumination is not actually a thinking problem. It masquerades as cognition, but it is an unresolved feeling problem. The thought loop plays endlessly because the underlying emotion was never addressed. The brain is frantically trying to think its way out of a feeling. You are using logic to try and fix an emotion. You are trying to use logic to resolve the terror of conflict, the deep-seated anxiety of not being enough, the fear of rejection. The thoughts are just the exhaust fumes of an engine burning pure anxiety. And if the nervous system is genuinely biologically wired to absorb all of this, and childhood trained it to monitor everyone nearby just to stay safe, is fixing this even possible? It is. The goal is not to rip the smoke detector out of the ceiling. The goal is recalibration, teaching your system the difference between steam from a boiling pot and an actual house fire. But to do that, you first have to understand what that constant blaring alarm is physically doing to your brain. Which brings us to John Sweller's cognitive load theory from 1998. Sweller demonstrated that human working memory has a strictly limited capacity for processing information at any given moment. It is a finite biological resource. Now apply that to a highly sensitive person. If you are subconsciously absorbing the subtle frustration of your partner, the unspoken tension in your office, and the weird tone of a cashier at the grocery store, you are stuffing your working memory full of emotional data. The analogy that kept coming back to me while reading this was an internet browser with 50 tabs open. One tab is playing a video on autoplay. 3 tabs are completely frozen, and you are sitting there wondering why your computer sounds like a jet engine when all you are trying to do is type a simple text document. The text document is whatever you are actually trying to do in the present moment: eat dinner, have a conversation, do your job. The 50 tabs are the unresolved emotional microstressors running in the background. Chidiac refers to this state as the thought prison, a self-reinforcing habit of rumination driven by a false promise of control. And that false promise is worth sitting with, because when you are in that spiral, analyzing what someone meant, it really does feel productive. It feels like you are solving a puzzle. But your brain is actively tricking you. When we ruminate, the brain releases a tiny drip of dopamine because we feel like we are working on the problem. We believe that if we just replay that awkward conversation one more time, we will uncover some hidden meaning, perfectly predict the person's next move, and therefore protect ourselves from future pain. But we are not actually solving anything. We are just wearing grooves into our neural pathways and draining the battery in the process, which ties into the research on self-regulation from Lord and his colleagues in 2010. Lord's theory looks at how we navigate the world. We set goals, we compare our current progress to those goals, and we modify our behavior to close the gap. And that takes energy, a lot of it. When you are faced with relentless micro-stressors, those 50 open tabs, you experience a massive drain on your cognitive resources. Psychologists previously called this ego depletion. The idea that willpower is basically a gas tank, and every time you make a decision or deal with stress, the tank goes down until you are running on fumes. Though the science on ego depletion has evolved significantly, major reviews like the work by Voss and her colleagues in 2021 have shown it is not quite as simple as a mechanical gas tank running to absolute zero. Things like beliefs about willpower, personal motivation, and even blood glucose all play complex roles. But even with those modern nuances, the fundamental reality remains completely intact. The constant background processing of other people's emotional states genuinely and severely diminishes your own cognitive and emotional resilience over time. There is an analogy that clicked hard for me while reading this. Imagine your mind is your bedroom. It is incredibly messy. Clothes all over the floor, books stacked haphazardly, empty mugs on the dresser. You can still walk through it. You live in it for a week and think, I am fine, I will clean it this weekend. But just existing in that room requires subconscious processing power. Your brain is constantly mapping the clutter so you do not trip. It is registering all the visual noise. Then one Tuesday morning, you accidentally drop your phone on the floor and you just lose it. You burst into tears or start screaming. Not because of the phone, because your brain's processing capacity was already at 99% just dealing with the environment, and the dropped phone was simply the final 1% that crashed the system. The dropped phone is the text message from your boss. It is the slightly annoyed tone from your spouse. The reaction seems wildly disproportionate to the event because the people observing you only see the dropped phone. They do not see the 50 open browser tabs. They do not see the messy room. So here is the million-dollar question. If you can feel that your cognitive load is maxed out, why can't you just notice it in the moment, take a deep breath, and close the tabs? Every self-help account on social media says just reframe your thoughts, choose positivity, remember that their mood is not about you. But when you are actually in the spiral, that advice feels completely useless. Why is it so hard to think your way out of it? Because those solutions are cognitive answers to a biological system failure. There is fascinating science explaining why we fail to cope precisely when we need it most. Researchers from Harvard, Stanford, and the University of Maryland, a team led by Miljavsky, Kruglansky, and Gross, published a study in 2018 on this. They applied something called cognitive energetics theory to emotional reappraisal. Any mental task you try to perform, like trying to calm down after a stinging comment from a coworker, is a tug of war between two opposing forces. First, the driving force. This is your motivation. You hate feeling angry. You want to feel peaceful. So your drive to regulate your emotion is high. But pulling on the other side is the restraining force, the sheer cognitive difficulty of the mental gymnastics required to reframe the situation, combined with your brain's evolutionary desire to conserve energy. Because reframing is exhausting. It requires you to process what happened, generate alternative perspectives, and actively override a highly stimulated nervous system response. So it is basically your motivation saying, let us calm down, and your exhausted brain saying, constructing a balanced narrative about why your coworker is acting like this is going to take way too much glucose, so we are just going to stay angry. But the real genius of Miljavsky's study was how they factored in emotional intensity. Logic would tell us that if an emotion is incredibly intense, if you are absolutely furious or deeply hurt, you will be highly motivated to change it. Your driving force should peak. And it does. But the researchers discovered that emotional intensity acts as a driving force and a restraining force simultaneously. The higher the emotional intensity, the more it physically disrupts your cognitive pathways. The restraining force scales up right alongside your motivation. In the study, they showed people images that varied in emotional intensity. When predicting for others, participants assumed people would logically choose to reframe the highly upsetting images. But when they had to do the hard work themselves, they gave up. When the emotion was highly intense, they chose to reappraise significantly less often than with mild emotions. The sheer cognitive difficulty of wrestling with a high-intensity feeling was simply too high. So the worse you feel, the more desperate you are to feel better, but the harder it biologically is for your brain to actually execute the strategy that would make you feel better. The system locks you out. And this brings us back to Chidiac's framework for highly sensitive people, because everything feels intense to an HSP. Every minor slight feels high intensity. A weird look from a friend does not feel like a 2 out of 10 on the stress scale. An enmeshed nervous system registers it as an 8. Therefore, trying to use logic, trying to think positive, trying to semantically reframe the event in the heat of the moment will almost always fail. You cannot bypass a cognitive overload with more cognition. So, what do you actually do when you are standing in the kitchen, obsessing over a comment, and you can feel the spiral taking over? You have to change your point of intervention entirely. You stop trying to change the thought, and you go straight to the physiology, the body. This is where Chidiac's practical toolkit becomes incredibly valuable. He outlines something called the witness practice. It is about shifting your identity from being the person drowning in the emotion to being the person standing on the shore, observing the water. Step 1 is hyperspecific. Label the emotion precisely. And before you say that is what you are already doing when you spiral, there is an important distinction. When we spiral, we usually drown in a vague, global sense of panic or outrage. We say, I am so overwhelmed, or this is a disaster. Labeling is clinical. It is saying this is anxiety or this is humiliation. There is hard neurology behind this. When you search for the precise word to describe an emotion, you force your brain to divert blood flow and electrical activity into the prefrontal cortex, the language and logic center. By simply activating the prefrontal cortex to find the word, you naturally downregulate the activity in the amygdala, the fear center. You are literally stealing power away from the panic alarm to turn on the dictionary. Once you have the label, you move to step 2, creating linguistic distance. Instead of saying I am angry, which fuses your entire identity with the emotion, you change the language. You say I notice anger arising. It sounds detached, almost robotic, but that detachment is the goal. You are creating a gap between your core self and the temporary physiological state. You are the sky. The anger is just a dark cloud passing through. You are breaking the enmeshment with your own internal weather. Step 3 is the most crucial part of bypassing the cognitive bottleneck, grounding in the physical body. You have to get out of the mind entirely because the mind is a compromised environment right now. This is where the 5-4-3-2-1 technique comes in. 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 you can hear, 2 you can smell, 1 you can taste. It sounds almost too simple, but it works on the exact same principle as the labeling, and it is even more powerful. When you force your attention onto raw, immediate physical sensory data, you are demanding that your brain process information through the sensory cortex. Your working memory, that strictly limited resource Sweller described, can only hold so much. If you flood it with the texture of the carpet, the smell of the coffee, and the hum of the refrigerator, there is literally no processing power left to maintain the anxiety loop. You pull the plug on the mental story that is fueling the emotional fire. Think of it like uncoupling the cars on a freight train. The physical feeling in your chest, the adrenaline, the tightness, that is the engine. The spiraling thoughts, they hate me, I always ruin things, I am going to get fired, that is the cargo. If you unhook the engine from the cargo using sensory grounding, the thoughts lose their momentum. They slowly grind to a halt on the tracks. You treat the emotional chaos as a physiological event, not a cognitive destiny. You address the body first, soothe the nervous system, and only then, once the intensity has lowered and the restraining force has dropped, does your rational brain unlock again. And once the rational brain is back online, you cannot just sit there staring at the carpet. You have to do something with that energy, which brings up a fascinating piece of research from Elliott and Thrash in 2002 regarding goal setting and what Chidiac calls the redirection protocol. Because once you are stabilized, the way you choose your next action determines whether you stay free or get pulled right back into the thought prison. Elliott and Thrash distinguish between avoidance goals and approach goals. An avoidance goal is trying not to do something or not to feel something. I want to stop thinking about my ex. I need to prove to my boss that I am not an idiot. I need to win this argument so they do not think I am weak. It feels like a solid goal, but it is a trap. Avoidance goals keep your psychological energy tethered directly to the source of your distress. You are still letting them dictate your actions. Your entire motivation is built around the threat. An approach goal, however, is moving towards something positive, meaningful, and entirely within your own control. Instead of composing the perfect, devastating message to put someone in their place, or plotting how to overcompensate at the next meeting, you redirect. You take one concrete action toward your own life. You go water your plants. You work on a personal project. You read a chapter of a book. You redirect the energy toward building yourself up rather than tearing the threat down. It breaks the illusion that the other person holds the key to your emotional regulation. But knowing how to stabilize your internal landscape inevitably leads you into difficult territory. Because once you learn to uncouple the train and redirect your goals, you have to start protecting that new piece. And that means dealing with other people. That means drawing boundaries. Boundaries, the ultimate buzzword of the decade. But here is the brutal reality. Setting boundaries inevitably introduces the hardest emotion for a highly sensitive person to deal with: guilt. The second you try to protect your peace, it feels like you are doing something terrible to the other person. And that is exactly why guilt is the great enforcer of the status quo. If you want to change how much you let people affect you, you have to dismantle your relationship with guilt. The most vital distinction to understand here is the difference between real guilt and manipulation disguised as guilt. Real guilt is a healthy, useful internal signal. It flashes when you have genuinely acted against your own core values. If you value honesty and you lie to a friend to get out of something and you feel terrible about it, that is real guilt. It is your conscience prompting you to repair a breach of your own integrity. But the other kind is engineered compliance. It is manipulation disguised as guilt. It is a tactic used by people who rely on you having no boundaries so they can get their needs met. They want you to do something that serves them, and when you say no, they weaponize your own empathy against you to make you feel like a bad person. When you tell a friend you cannot help them move on your only day off in 3 weeks and they sigh and say, "Wow, okay, I guess I am just on my own then. It is fine, I know you are busy. I will figure it out even though my back is killing me," that sick feeling in your stomach is not real guilt. You have not violated a core moral value by needing a day of rest. You are experiencing engineered compliance. And highly sensitive people fall for it constantly, partly because of the sunk cost fallacy. We look at a friendship and think, I have already invested 5 years into this person. I have already helped them through 3 crises. I cannot say no now. It would invalidate everything I have done. So we cave. We stay enmeshed. We continue to carry their emotional weight. But the physical cost of caving is not just a fleeting moment of annoyance. The research from Charles Figley in 2002 on compassion fatigue is genuinely shocking. Figley's research looked at what happens to the body and mind when an individual constantly takes on the emotional burdens of others. We used to think compassion fatigue was something only trauma nurses, social workers, or first responders experienced. But it absolutely applies to everyday relationships if you are chronically enmeshed. The symptoms mirror clinical PTSD. Chronic emotional exhaustion, skyrocketing blood pressure, severely weakened immune systems, a profound sense of detachment and hopelessness, just from carrying someone else's stress. Your nervous system cannot differentiate between their trauma and your own. You are paying a very real biological price to keep them comfortable. So if it is literally affecting your immune system, if it is producing PTSD symptoms, why is it still so terrifying to simply say to a friend, "I do not have the capacity for this conversation right now"? Why does the word no feel like jumping out of an airplane? To understand that terror, you have to look at attachment theory. John Bowlby's foundational work from 1988 explains that early childhood experiences form the template for how we view relationships and survival. If you grew up in an environment where expressing your needs, saying no, or setting a boundary led to anger, rejection, or the withdrawal of love from your caregivers, your infant brain wired a very specific equation: boundaries equal abandonment, and abandonment to a child equals death. So there you are, 30 years old, just trying to decline a crowded dinner party, and your nervous system is screaming, if you say no, you will be cast out of the tribe, and you will die alone in the wilderness. The physiological response is entirely disproportionate to the actual social risk, which is why Chidiac introduces the boundary reinforcement system and guided guilt release. You cannot wait until you are in the heat of the moment to set a boundary, because your amygdala will hijack you. You have to prepare your boundaries in advance when you are calm. And more importantly, when you do set the boundary, you have to radically change how you interpret the guilt that follows. Chidiac suggests treating the guilt as a withdrawal symptom. Your brain is addicted to the old pattern of people-pleasing because historically, people-pleasing kept you safe from conflict. When you set a boundary, you're cutting off the supply of that false safety. The guilt you feel is not the signal that you did something morally wrong. It is your brain experiencing chemical withdrawal as it struggles to rewire new neural pathways. You have to sit with the sickness. You have to let the guilt wash over you and recognize it as the feeling of your brain healing, not a command to apologize. And here is the key insight underneath all of it. People will keep unloading on you because you make it easy for them to do so. If you do not enforce boundaries, you are not actually being kind to them. You are actively participating in your own depletion. By always absorbing their issues, by always being the sponge for their chaos, you are depriving them of the friction they need to develop their own emotional resilience. You are enabling their dysfunction. Stepping back is not an act of cruelty. It is the act of returning their emotional responsibilities back to where they belong. But here is where it gets complicated in practice. You return the responsibility, you set the boundary, you say, I cannot talk about this right now, and the very next thing they say is, why? What did I do? Are you mad at me? And just like that, the trap snaps shut and you are right back in the enmeshment, which is exactly why mastering emotional detachment is the necessary next step. And we have to be careful with that term because a lot of people confuse emotional detachment with being cold or shut down entirely. True emotional detachment is about being unbothered without losing your warmth. Chidiac offers a specific visualization technique to achieve this called the compassionate container. Imagine the other person's chaotic emotions, their anger, their anxiety, their venting, as a rush of dirty, muddy water. As a highly sensitive and enmeshed person, you normally act like a sponge. You absorb all of it into your own being until you are soaked, heavy, and exhausted. The compassionate container technique asks you to visualize a beautiful clear glass sitting right on the table between you and them. As they speak, you allow them to pour their emotional water into the glass. You can see it clearly. You can acknowledge how turbulent the water is. You can hold space for it, but it never touches you. It stays in the glass. You can be entirely present, completely compassionate, and verbally supportive without absorbing a single drop of their crisis into your own nervous system. I see your water, I honor your water, but I am not drinking your water. And when they notice the glass, when they demand to know why you are not absorbing their chaos the way you used to, that is where we encounter the trap of over-explaining. As recovering people pleasers, we feel this intense compulsion to justify our growth. We want to explain our new boundaries to people who frankly have not earned access to our inner world. We operate under the delusion that if we just find the perfect combination of words, they will finally understand us, validate the boundary, and give us permission to have it. It feels like being on trial. We act like if we just present enough evidence, point out enough past behavior, and build a strong enough logical case, the other person will bang the gavel and say, you know what, you are right, your boundary is valid. But here is what the psychology is actually pointing out. We are not in a courtroom. There is no judge. We do not need a verdict. When you over-explain yourself, when you write that 4-paragraph text message justifying why you cannot come to the party, you are subtly communicating that your boundary is up for debate. You are handing the locus of control right back to them. You are saying, here is my boundary, do you approve? And if they say no, the boundary collapses. This is why Chidiac introduces what he calls the minimal explanation policy. It requires internalizing that no is a complete sentence. It requires understanding that silence in the face of manipulation is a boundary in itself. The trauma therapist Shannon Thomas articulated this perfectly when she wrote that closure is something you give yourself, not something you get from someone else. That means accepting the reality that they might walk away thinking you are a terrible person and being okay with that. Because over-explaining is driven by a lingering subconscious need for the other person's approval. You want to set the boundary, but you also want them to like you for setting it. You want to be independent, but you want them to applaud your independence. By dropping the explanations, you shift the locus of control entirely back to your own center. You accept the discomfort of being misunderstood as the necessary price of admission for your own peace. Now, we have decoded the biological hardware of the highly sensitive person. We understand cognitive load and why you cannot think your way out of a spiral. We have the witness practice and the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique to bypass the bottleneck. We know the difference between real guilt and manipulation. We have the compassionate container, and we know not to over-explain our boundaries. On paper, the psychological shield is built. But if we step back and critically examine this entire framework, and specifically the way Chidiac structures this book, there is a massive uncomfortable tension that has to be confronted. Because if it is not, this whole system quietly becomes another trap. When you analyze the chapters, a highly significant portion of the text is dedicated to identifying the bad actors in your life. It teaches you how to spot the manipulators, the gaslighters, the energy vampires, the toxic people. It essentially provides a field guide to bad behavior, and reading those sections is incredibly validating if you are currently dealing with a difficult boss or an emotionally abusive partner. But the irony runs deep. The title of the book is Stop Letting Everything Affect You. The core promise is emotional sovereignty, the ability to move through the world centered in yourself. But to achieve that sovereignty, the book asks you to spend a massive amount of cognitive energy keeping your attention hyper-focused on other people. A framework supposedly designed to free you from the influence of others spends page after page teaching you how to meticulously diagnose them. It keeps the locus of your attention permanently externalized. Critical analysis of the text pointed out this exact limitation. While Chidiac relies heavily on the concept of individual agency, he places the reader in a constant state of diagnosing the outside world. It creates hypervigilance. If you build a massive impenetrable fortress to keep out the dragons, and your whole life becomes about standing on the watchtower scanning the horizon for dragons, learning the different species of dragons, studying dragon behavior, preparing dragon defenses, your whole life is still defined by the dragons. You have not actually found peace. You are just living in constant reaction to them from behind a very thick wall. That is the deepest and most challenging insight of this entire exploration. True emotional sovereignty requires a radical shift in the questions we ask. At a certain point, you have to stop asking what is wrong with them and start asking what is it in me that keeps choosing these dynamics. If you keep finding yourself surrounded by toxic people, at what point do you stop analyzing their toxicity and start examining your own magnetism to it? When is the problem genuinely them, and when is the problem the story you are telling about them to avoid looking at your own wounds? Diagnosing others is deeply comfortable. It is easy to say my boss is a covert narcissist, my ex was toxic, my friend is an energy vampire. It wraps you in the warm blanket of being the innocent victim. But excavating your own internal landscape, asking why you tolerate poor treatment, why you seek validation from emotionally unavailable people, why your core identity is so wrapped up in being the savior or the martyr, that requires a level of profound accountability that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. So here is where Chidiac leaves us, and here is the honest version that most summaries of this book will not say. What the book genuinely gets right, it gets very right. The distinction between feeling deeply and letting everything affect you is real, and it is important. Almost nobody in the self-help space has drawn that line as clearly as this book does. If you are someone who has been told your whole life that your sensitivity is a problem, that you feel too much, care too much, take things too personally, this book gives you something most books in this space never offer. It gives you a way to keep the sensitivity and lose the suffering. For the right reader at the right moment, that reframe alone is worth the entire book. The boundary chapter is also genuinely useful. The distinction between real guilt, which is a signal that you have acted against your own values, and guilt as a manipulation tactic used by people who want your compliance, is one of the clearest articulations of that idea anywhere. If you have ever said yes when you meant no because the discomfort of disappointing someone felt unbearable, that chapter will feel like someone finally gave language to something you have been living for years. But the book has a structural problem, and it is worth naming. The title is Stop Letting Everything Affect You. The promise is emotional sovereignty, but a significant portion of the book is built around identifying the people in your life who are manipulating you, gaslighting you, draining you. And here is what that quietly does. It keeps the locus of your emotional life exactly where the book claims to move it away from, outside of you, in other people's hands, dependent on correctly identifying who around you is a threat. True emotional sovereignty, the kind the book is actually promising, requires something harder and less comfortable than learning to spot manipulators. It requires asking, what is it in me that keeps choosing these dynamics? What wound is being touched when this person's comment sends me spiraling for 3 hours? Chidiac gestures toward this, but he never pushes hard enough into it. The book is far more comfortable diagnosing the outside world than excavating the inside one. For readers who need validation right now, who are genuinely in difficult situations with genuinely difficult people, that comfort is real and it is valuable, but it has a ceiling. At a certain point, the path forward stops being about better identification of who is toxic and starts being about becoming someone who is not destabilized by ordinary human friction. Those are different projects. This book is excellent at the first. It is incomplete on the second. So here is the honest recommendation. Read this book if you need permission to stop absorbing everyone else's emotional weather. Read it if you have never been given the language for the difference between empathy and self-abandonment. Read it if understanding manipulation and setting boundaries is genuinely urgent for where you are right now. And then, when you are ready, read something that asks harder questions about your own patterns, something that looks inward with the same forensic attention this book looks outward. Chidiac gives you the shield. You will eventually need to examine what you are protecting, because the people who truly stop letting everything affect them are not the ones who finally found the right label for everyone around them. They are the ones who got so grounded in their own center that other people's chaos simply stopped having an address to arrive at.